Rafuse. I'm the writer and director and co-producer, weirdly enough, of Véillée, which is a French language film shot in Canada.
So what inspired you to shoot La Véillée?
It actually comes from my partner's family. He's from his mother's lineage, I guess, is Franco-Newfoundlander. So there are small pockets of French-speaking Canadians like throughout Atlantic Canada, and Newfoundland's in particular is particularly isolated. It's on like a small peninsula on the west coast of our island. And they have a very specific dialect and turns of phrase and stories. And so when I started kind of looking into family history stuff, just kind of so I knew what I was getting myself into in this family, I came upon the tradition of la conte, which is the tradition of storytelling from that part of the island. And a lot of it is like, you know, your typical fairy stories, or, you know, cloaked warnings for how to live your life and things like that. And fairies are a huge part of that. And being someone who was always obsessed with that kind of stuff as a kid, it kind of reignited, I guess, that spark to make that creepy stuff that I'd always wanted to make. So
what was the production process like?
The production process was long. I got the award to make the film in late 2019. By March 2020, of course, COVID had hit, everything was shut down. So rather than kind of, you know, push through it, we just decided we're gonna wait a year, see what happens. Everybody is cool with it. It's like something that's never been dealt with before, right? So we pushed it by a year, and that gave us all the time in the world to start planning this, find the right crew, figure out what we wanted to do aesthetically, sonically, all that kind of stuff. So it was really, really well planned out, and I had a couple of really great co-producers with me, Anna Wheeler and Jackie Hines, who are like powerhouses, upcoming powerhouses in this city for you know, helping people out, creating content and all that. And they are just a wealth of information. So they took care of a lot of the behind the scenes stuff while I got to focus on, you know, just what I wanted to see on the screen. And it shows everything was so meticulously planned out. And we couldn't have, like, here in Newfoundland, it's a toss-up whether you'll get good weather. You can see 3 to 4 seasons on a good day. So the fact that we had everything just timed out perfectly on the day of the shoot, we were like, I don't know if it's gonna be too windy, is it gonna rain, it could be blowing a gale, we don't know what's gonna happen. But it all worked out like miraculously smoothly, the 3 days that we shot, so it was lovely.
So you said that you received an award, correct, to make the film. What was the process of getting funding like that for you guys? Like, what did you reach out to? Who did you reach out to? How did you hear about the award? You know, the opportunities to apply for it?
Absolutely. The RBC Michelle Jackson Emerging Filmmaker Award is the award that I won, and it's offered to emerging women directors specifically. Now, I'm more of a writer, but I do direct my own projects from time to time. So that kind of came up on my radar as my next jumping point after my last short. And once, like, it comes with a bunch of in-kind rentals and stuff like that, and it's wonderful mentorship and script development and all kinds of stuff. And it's a really great package to kind of take to other funders. Like for here, for example, you can get funding through the city, which is the City of St. John's. And there's provincial funding, which is kind of like state arts funding through our organization, Arts NL. So if you bring that package to them and say, look, I've already got like this little handful of stuff, I just need you to help me with this part and this part. And they gratefully threw some money at it. And I mean, making any kind of short these days, you can make something on an absolutely nothing budget, but if you really want to treat your people well and make sure they're well compensated, you got to get that funding. So for like a 5 to 7 minute short for us, it was like as shoestring as we could make it, but thankfully all the funders came through and we had just enough to be able to squeak by, and thanks to some people's generosity, it actually looks better than our budget would have you imagine.
That's what you like to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it sounds like where you're from, they have some grants, right, that you're able to apply for. How important is it for communities to recognize the arts and the grants that enable filmmakers and artists like yourself to really execute the projects that you're looking to execute?
It's incredibly important. We're lucky that here in Newfoundland, in our part of Canada, that the arts are very, very well funded, especially things like music and theater. They're mainstays here. People just couldn't survive, especially the winters. People couldn't survive without them. So they're well funded. And the film industry is also doing a lot of big things here these days. We have a bunch of shows that are on the go. And so it's becoming more and more apparent to our government and our organizations that increased funding is actually what's needed. And it's become a huge industry here. Like the fishing industry used to be the mainstay here, and now entertainment is kind of creeping up there. We're actually making that like a tentpole industry in this province, which is amazing. And we cannot do it without all of the important funders that we have. We have a few different funding bodies here. Like I said, the city funders, you can get municipal funding from different towns, you can get provincial funding, and there is like national funding as well for that stuff, but it's really hard to get and super selective. So never been lucky with that one yet.
So what inspires you to be a director? What stories, what tales, what prior films have inspired you to get to this point?
Oh gosh, prior films, like I was raised on a strict diet of like Roland Emmerich and Steven Spielberg.
Oh, yeah.
Like that was like what my dad was into, and so it's kind of like I was always buddy with him, so that's what I wanted to watch. So I wanted to watch like the alien takeover movies and the strange like the strange alien stuff or monster stuff. But at the same time, I was really excited about things like local folklore and local like ghost stories and things like that growing up. And I was like, well, if I can combine the two and just kind of do a little bit of everything. And that's kind of how I discovered genre, and that it was really this whole big thing. So I've kind of been playing with elements of that over the years, working, refining it, developing it, trying to figure out what are the stories behind the artifice of what I'm telling. Like, sure, we have fairies and other worlds that are suggested in this film, but what's the story that's running underneath it? Like, what is it carrying? And that kind of process has been really, really fun for me to play around with. I'm actually adapting this short into a feature length that kind of explores the world and the circumstances around the boy and why he is in that place at that time. And it's kind of a further development of that, of like what's carrying this story and what is the human element that goes along with the monster.
So you said this is taking a lot of inspiration from folklore. Mm-hmm. Do you find that local folklore where you're at is prevalent? Is it still very much so in the public consciousness, or is this you taking that folklore and trying to give it new life?
It's interesting because in Atlantic Canada, and I'd say especially like Cape Breton, which is part of Nova Scotia, and then Newfoundland, we have much more of an Irish Scottish heritage. And so I think we tend to hold on to those folklores and those fables and myths and things like that a lot stronger for some reason. And then there's also places where it's been mixed with Indigenous heritage and Indigenous stories and things like that. And those still circulate exclusively by our oral tradition in most cases. So oral storytelling is very, very important here. And just culturally, because of the isolation of communities, because of the Indigenous heritage of the place, it all just kind of perfect storms into this wonderful oral heritage that we have. And the university here actually several years ago made it a point to go out to these remote communities and do audio like tape interviews with like the local elders and kind of culture keepers of these communities, and actually got all of this on tape, and it's in the archives in the university. So using a lot of that for my research and to kind of inform the history and the story was super, super important.
Gotta love the local universities. Without them, we would all just plummet into darkness.
I know, we'd have such a bland overview of what specific places are, in like instead of knowing the rich history of very specific places, which is very cool.
I agree. We could have a much deeper conversation about that later on.
Totally.
So what horror films inspire you, or would you consider Véillée a horror film, or would you consider it a fantasy film, or would you consider it folklore?
It's a little bit of all three. I have a very hard time pinpointing what exact genre I'm working in at any given time. Like, there's a project that I'm working on right now that is a proof of concept sci-fi rom-com, and it's also queer. So it's like this weird mix of stuff, and I'm like, I don't know how to describe it. So that's kind of how I feel about Véillée. It's a little bit, it's got that kind of thriller edge where you don't know what's going to happen. And hopefully in the feature version that'll be much more pronounced. But it is also kind of this, it's if you dig into it and then you dig into the folklore, you will get the horror story, because fairies are not something you mess around with. They are kind of grotesque creatures that can leave really grotesque effects on the human body if you believe the stories. So if you have that kind of knowledge of the stories and the folklore behind the film, you kind of get a little bit more of that sense of dread and the kind of horror of what's about to happen, a little bit more than if you're just coming into it blind, with no knowledge of the culture. So it does depend for some people. For some people, it's just a spooky bedtime story. For other people, it's like, oh my God, my grandmother had the exact same experience. She was never the same. Like, it could really go either way for people.
How do you feel Canadian films and Newfoundland's burgeoning industry, how do you feel that you are differentiating yourselves from other countries?
I'd say my film is pretty stereotypically Canadian in a weird way. We're kind of obsessed we have this reputation, I guess, in Canada of telling the stories that come from like deep within us and our heritage and our lineage. So we tend to explore the self a lot, and our works tend to be, I don't know if autobiographical is really the word for it, but they definitely tend to explore more of like, here's where we are, this moment.
Yeah.
I don't know why. It's just I guess it's kind of baked into our country's collective sense of like, what is Canada anyway? We all come from different places. We all want different things. Like, so we have a weird kind of identity crisis as Canadians, and it kind of shows in our work. But I'm not sure if my work differentiates so much. It's not necessarily a story of myself that I'm telling. It's a story of, the family of someone I care about, basically. I've lost the plot completely. What was the question? How does it differentiate?
Yeah, how does Canadian film, Newfoundland film differentiate? Like, what is Newfoundland like known for?
Newfoundland is known for fog, bad weather, lots of fish, or the lack thereof these days. And I think people really take that into account when they're making films. It feels, things from Newfoundland, they feel, there's a very specific feeling to living in Newfoundland and to being here. And I think every director who's from here or works here tries to capture that in some way. And whether it's the kind of the feeling of isolation, or kind of being out in the middle of it all, because I mean we're kind of stranded out in the Atlantic Ocean here. That comes across in the work a lot. Themes of isolation, what it means to live so closely with the land, especially the water. So you get a lot of stories about people making their living by the sea and things that happen because of that. things like that. And then generational questions as well, like our fathers and grandfathers were fishers or they were plant workers, and we don't have that industry now. What are we going to be? So again, going back to the Canadian identity question, but just a little bit more doom and gloom in there because Newfoundland can be such a gloomy place.
I think that's the case with pretty much anything that's on the coast, right? Eventually something's going to come out of the water and grab you. You just have to wait and see what that is, you know?
Right? It's like the lighthouse out here. It's absolutely, you can drive yourself crazy waiting for good weather.
As long as it doesn't turn into the end of the lighthouse, I think we're all good.
Thank you.
So what's next for you? What's the big plan going forward? You said you had a feature-length film that's a larger, or not, I guess not larger, but it's expanding. What you've done with Véillée, where are you at in the process?
I'm in the revision process for the script part of that. So trying to work it into something that can catch someone's eye, bring on a producer, because what I really want to do is give everybody the story of what happens to this boy after he's taken by the fairies. So I want to go into that fairy world and show everybody the kind of twisted world that it is, and the ramifications that can have, and like the psychological price, I guess, of what he does or what he is forced to do, I guess, if you believe that he's taken or if he goes willingly. So yeah, I'm kind of exploring that, and so it's in the scripting process, it's in revisions, trying to make it as tight as we can. And I was lucky enough again to get some funding for that through a local film development corporation who kind of sponsored my story edits and things like that. So I was writing in my own time, but at least I had someone covering the edits, which was really lovely. So yeah, I'm doing that, and in continuous pre-production on the aforementioned sci-fi rom-com idea, which hopefully will get off the ground by the end of the year, but we're in a bit of a holding pattern at the moment. So
you mentioned that you have some other short films that you've done as well. Do you find them to be in keeping with the same themes that you're exploring with Véillée, or were they different stories altogether?
My last story, which was brought to me by my producer at the time, Mike Hickey, who's a wonderful kind of genre captain in this province when it comes to making horror films and promoting horror content. He's like the guy to go to. He brought to me this story of a shipwreck in a place called Chance Cove, and the community that was around there that suddenly up and disappeared overnight. I thought, well, he's like, well, we can do something with this. Like, here's the story right here. So we kind of went back and forth and devised this story, and then I wrote out this wonderful script of a group of post-secondary students, university students, who go on an archaeological or anthropological expedition to this abandoned village, only to find that there is it is inhabited by a vengeful ghost of a shipwreck victim. So I was still drawing from, local folklore and stuff like that, and local myths and legends and things. And it's great when people just kind of slide them across my desk and they're like, I thought you could use this. Here's this tidbit for you. And I'm like, hey. Pocket it away for later, because that all turns into ideas, because Newfoundland has so much, like, it has about 1,000 years of history, of like written history going back. You have the indigenous people who have been here for tens of thousands of years. You have Vikings, and you have early European settlers, and then like kind of the list goes on. So you have all of these combining forces that just give so many stories to this place. And so I don't think I'll ever run out of stories to pick from here, because there's just too many. There's too many different ways to tell a story here.
That's a good problem to have.
It is. It's a very good problem to have.
I really appreciate every moment of your time here today. Yeah, I hope you had a good time chatting with me.
Awesome. Thanks so much, David.